Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to 5 times 15. Tonight, we're delighted to bring you a series of talks from a lineup of highly esteemed writers and thinkers, all of whom bring such unique perspectives about society, community, and what it means to be human. Without any further ado, we're going to kick off this evening with the human body. Our first speaker, Lewis Dartnell, is an astrobiology researcher and professor at the University of Westminster. Lewis is the author of numerous best-selling science books, including The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch, and Origins, How the Earth Shaped Human History, which has been translated into 26 languages. His new book, Being Human, is a unique reframing of human history as shaped by our physical abilities and limitations. Lewis, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, my camera's now on as well. So what I was trying to achieve and set out to do with this new book was explore all the different fundamental aspects of us as an animal species, of our humanness, whether that's our genetics or our physiology and our anatomy, or our psychology and weird glitches in our processing, so-called cognitive biases. And what I want to do for you tonight is pick out just one of the stories from that book, which is a story about the human family and the effects that that's had through human history. And over the course of our evolutionary lineage, from when we diverged from the common ancestor with the chimpanzees around 7 million years ago, there's been two major themes or trends in our evolution. We developed to be bipedal, so walking upright on two legs, and we also developed to be big-brained, with greater and greater intelligence that gave us our capabilities for language and communication, or tool use and inventing technologies, or working together and cooperating in these huge ventures, which led up to development of civilization itself. But these two biological adaptations, being bipedal and being big-brained, are mutually exclusive and direct conflict with each other. And the modifications to the human pelvis enabling bipedalism limits the size of the hole in the pelvis, that the birth canal, that the skull of the baby can pass through. So you can see at the bottom of the slide here, what's known as the midwife's view of the pelvis. And the human species today exists right at the cusp of those two mutually exclusive design principles. We couldn't develop to be any more intelligent without the skull getting stuck in the birth canal. And the solution hit upon by evolution was to extend the human developmental process long after birth, after we emerged from the womb. So although all mammals are fed by their mother, and in fact the name for that class of animals comes from the Latin word for breast, from mama, human babies and then infants are enormously vulnerable for several years after they're born, and dependent on for movement, for protection, for being fed. And so in our evolution, it arose that the woman herself, the mother herself, could no longer rear a child sufficiently, and it needed the assistance of the father as well for child rearing, what's known as biparental investment, and that's pretty rare within the animal kingdom. And that biparental investment requires what's effectively a biological contract for reproduction. The woman needs to be confident that the man will stick around through those vulnerable years of child rearing and provide the resources and assistance which is needed. And in turn, the man needs to be confident in the relationship and that he is in fact the father of that child when he devotes the time and resources towards rearing it. And the solution that evolution hit upon is known as pair bonding. There's a deep link forged between mother and father, and we experience that as romantic love. Now, that pair bond is mediated by a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin does a whole range of things in mammalian reproduction. It triggers the contractions of the uterus through childbirth itself. It stimulates lactation and the production of milk, and it forms a strong bond between the mother and child. And in humans, that oxytocin bond was then extended to join the mother and father as well. And so the practice of marriage is no more than a cultural institution built on top of that biological foundation of pair bonding. And at the core of human extended networks of relatives is that tight bond between parents and children, i.e. the human family. So as a consequence of human evolution to become both bipedal and big-brained, the solution of pair bonding gave rise to both romantic love and the human family. And with the emergence of agriculture and the ability to accumulate resources, whether that's the grain that you've harvested or the livestock that you keep, came the concept of wealth and claims over territory. And so we came to inherit not just physical traits from our parents, things like our eye color, but now also wealth and territory and the status and influence that they afford. So inheritable power gave rise to monarchy and ruling dynasties, and succession of the absolute power from one individual to the next within the same family down the generations produced a deep link between kinship, between relations, and kingship, between absolute power. So within these ruling dynasties that emerged, these fundamental aspects of our biology, of reproduction, of pair bonding, family, took on a whole new level of significance. Marriage wasn't just a union between two individuals, but it came to represent the tying together of two powerful families. And strategic marriages were used as a political tool to secure peace or cement alliances. And the children born of that marriage intertwined the bloodlines of both dynasties and were able to inherit both kingdoms, both crowns. So the human imperatives of pair bonding and reproduction became tools of statecraft. And one of the most influential royal dynasties in European modern history over the centuries were the Habsburgs. And they had relatively humble beginnings in the Duchy of Swabian, what is today northern Switzerland, and they're able to maneuver themselves to become the de facto inheritable crown of the Holy Roman Empire in parts of Germany and Central Europe. And then the Habsburg king Maximilian I began this mastermind scheme of strategic royal marriages with other kingdoms all across Europe, starting with his own marriage in 1477 to the heiress of the Duchy of Burgundy, which acquired for the Habsburgs parts of France and the Low Counties. He then arranged for his son to marry the heiress of both Castile and Aragon, and therefore their son came to rule over a unified Spain, as well as parts of southern Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily. And Maximilian also arranged for his grandson to marry Isabella of Portugal in 1526. So within just 50 years, within just 2 generations of carefully plotted marriages, the Habsburgs had accumulated over half of Europe. And this was more or less bloodlessly through dynastic marriages and the absorption of crowns. They were absolute grandmasters of the Game of Thrones. But this period also coincided with the beginning of the European age of exploration and conquest. And so you can see on the bottom map here, all the territories around the world that at some point were ruled by this Habsburg family, although not all at the same time. And that's parts of the Americas with the Spanish and Portuguese conquests, territories along the African coast and India, the Spice Islands, the Philippines were claimed by the explorer Magellan and named after Philip II of Spain. And you might notice from this map that even England, for a short period, fell into the Habsburg domain when Philip II married Queen Mary I in 1554. So the arms of this one family encircled the entire planet. In the early 16th century, Charles V became the first ruler in history to reign over an empire upon which the sun never set. But on his death, this single dominion was divided between his son and his brother, creating the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and the Central European branch of the family. And it's within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty that this program of strategic royal marriages had a particularly acute biological blowback. And the problem here is that consanguineous marriages between related royal families not only reinforces political power, but that inbreeding over the generations also reduces genetic variation and consolidates defective genes. So the very means of their ascendancy held the seeds for the catastrophic downfall of the Spanish Habsburgs. And out of a total of 11 marriages in the line of kings, leading down to Charles II, 9 of them were consanguineous, including between first cousins and the even creepier union between an uncle and his niece, so that the degree of inbreeding increased tenfold over the two centuries, separating the founding of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty with Philip II and Charles II. Now, the most visible, most conspicuous trait of the Habsburg dynasty was in their face. They had a long humped nose with an overhanging tip, a bulbous, drooping lower lip. So much so that Leopold I, who was Holy Roman Emperor in the second half of the 17th century, was very unkindly nicknamed in Austria as Fotzenpeutel, which you could translate as vagina face. But most noticeably within this family was a sharply jutting lower jaw, so pronounced that the top and lower rows of teeth no longer met each other, that the Spanish Habsburgs had trouble even chewing and eating their food. And this is the so-called Habsburg jaw. So the picture you can see here on the left-hand side is Maximilian I, who was the architect of this grand scheme of strategic royal marriages. And on the right-hand side is his great-great-great-grandson, Charles II, showing this very pronounced Habsburg jaw. And this Habsburg jaw is known to have been caused down the generations of inbreeding. But there were far more severe consequences for the Habsburgs. And the dynasty started suffering increasingly from epilepsy and other mental health issues, as well as a string of miscarriages and stillbirths. So this royal family, one of the most privileged and pampered in the entire world, with access to the best nutrition and healthcare available at the time, suffered an overall infant mortality rate of around 80%, which was around 4 times higher than a Spanish peasant family at the same time. And so for the Spanish Habsburgs, everything came to a head with Charles II, who was known as El Hechizado, the hexed or the cursed, due to his many severe afflictions from a whole host of genetic disorders. And he was never fit to rule as king. And so first his mother and then his second wife acted as regent on his behalf. And the only thing that the dynasty and the kingdom needed from him was that most fundamental of biological functions, which was simply to reproduce, just create an heir, so at least the dynasty can continue into the next generation. But despite 2 marriages, Charles II never had any children, and it seems quite clear that he was congenitally incapable of doing so. So these generations of inbreeding and the mounting genetic disorders in the Spanish dynasty had finally collapsed. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had driven itself to extinction. And with the death of Charles II in 1700, the crisis triggered the War of Spanish Succession, and ultimately a great shift in the political landscape of Europe. So what we've got here in this particular story is a long chain of cause and effect, going right back to the fundamentals of our biology in terms of our evolution towards being bipedal and brainy, and the evolutionary solution to that in terms of pair bonding and family, which gave rise to the inheritance of power and royal dynasties. And as we've just seen in the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, the biological blowback from that strategy of royal marriages. That's just one story from the book. There's plenty of others in Being Human. I've given a couple of examples here, which are basically the clickbait from the book. So if any of that has been of interest, pick up a copy of the book. I understand there's no questions as part of this 5x15 event, but by all means, feel welcome to tweet me, send a tweet, or ping me an email if there's anything that you're curious about. But thank you ever so much for coming along tonight and listening.
Lewis, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating insight into being human. For our second talk this evening, we're thrilled to be welcoming two speakers, the barristers Janina Ramirez and Keina Yoshida. They'll be speaking about their very powerful co-authored book, How Many More Women? The Silencing of Women by the Law and How to Stop It. Jennifer is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in London and has acted in key human rights and media freedom cases in domestic and international courts. Keina is a human rights barrister at the Centre for Reproductive Rights, an associate tenant at Doughty Street, and a visiting fellow at the Centre for Women, Peace and Security at the LSE. We're so pleased to have them both with us tonight. Jennifer and Keina, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Jack, and to 515 for having us this evening. I am going to start by talking about our book, How Many More Women, that was published in February in the UK and in October in Australia. And as Jack just said, I wrote it with my incredible co-author, who I hope you can see on screen as well, Janina Ramirez. And I want to just start by talking a little bit about why we wrote the book and what's the problem that we're trying to combat in writing this book. In 2017, as many of you will know, a hashtag went viral, Me Too. And there was a cascade of allegations, accusations, experiences with women and girls speaking out about gender-based violence, sexual harassment, sexual abuse in lots of different contexts. Gender-based violence is, according to the United Nations, the most pervasive human rights violation in the world. And 1 in 3 women and girls will suffer a form of gender-based violence, whether that be domestic abuse or some of the other forms of violence that women and girls face, be it online, offline, in technologically mediated spaces. In international law, there's also a right to live a life that is free from gender-based violence. But that right, as we all know, is far from being respected, protected, and fulfilled. And what we talk about in this book is, well, you know, how can we combat gender-based violence if we can't talk about it? In 2017, when the hashtag Me Too went viral after Tarana Burke started the campaign years before, Jen and I started to see in our practice the backlash against Me Too and against women and girls speaking out with these allegations and accusations. And what we started to see was, just as there was a cascade of allegations, there was a cascade of lawsuits. This is what the UN Special Rapporteur has called the weaponization of the law, or gendered censorship, with powerful industry figures using NDAs, privacy injunctions, or defamation claims in an attempt to silence these accusations and allegations. But it's not just powerful figures that have been able to use the law. In many of the cases that we talk about in the book, it is people in all different circumstances of life and from all different countries. In 2019, in the UK, the Supreme Court heard a really important case called Stalker and Stalker. And Jen and I were instructed by a human rights organization, Liberty, to intervene in the Supreme Court. So we worked together on that case. The Supreme Court didn't hear us. And that's why we decided to write the book with all the arguments that we would make. But the case just showed one of the problems that we are seeing in our practice. In that case, it was a matrimonial couple. They broke up, and Mrs. Stocker wrote on a Facebook wall that her ex-husband had tried to strangle her. He sued her in defamation. There's no legal aid for defamation, and although the police were called and red marks were noted down, he argued in the court that the idea of that her words that he tried to strangle was defamatory. The judge used a dictionary and looked at the technical legal definition, and he decided that his words meant that he had tried to silence her and not to kill her, and therefore she was liable in defamation. This went to the Court of Appeal, and finally in the Supreme Court, she would win. But she faced 7 years of litigations, high costs, a large amount of stress for going through this. And what is our right to free speech worth if we can't afford to protect it? What is going on in the balancing exercise between free speech and the right to reputation? Where is the other rights that exist in international law, such as the right to be free from gender-based violence, a right to equality, and in school contexts, for example, or universities, a right to education. So these are some of the big arguments we make in the book. And we do this by telling a series of stories, by interviewing women and journalists and activists from around the world, including the spearhead of the Japanese Me Too movement, Shiori Ito, who was sued after speaking out with her allegation of sexual assault. That went to the Supreme Court in Japan, where she eventually won. We've also interviewed two incredible feminist journalists in Colombia who are facing multiple lawsuits for printing accusations about a famous film director. And as Shiori said to us, this is different legal systems, same problem. And we're going to hand over to Jen now to talk about one of the cases that we talk about in the book.
Thank you, Keina, and great to be here, everyone. I'm going to use my time to talk about two related high-profile defamation cases in the UK and the US. The US trial is one you will have seen. It attracted global media attention and billions of hits on, literally billions of hits on Instagram and TikTok. You couldn't have missed it unless you were living under a rock. I'm talking about the defamation cases that were taken by Johnny Depp against, in relation to Amber Heard's allegations of domestic violence. Now, Depp first sued the Sun newspaper in the UK and lost. He then sued Amber personally in the US and he won. We highlight these cases in our book in a chapter entitled Her Truth on Trial Twice, not just because it was so high profile or because I had special insight into the case because I acted for Amber in the UK proceedings, but we highlight it because it provides an unprecedented comparative example of what happens when her truth goes on trial in defamation cases involving gender-based violence. And because it's a really important case study of how stereotypes about gender-based violence affect the approach of the media and society to women who make allegations, and the role of social media in these cases. This is a case that everyone seems to have an opinion on, Team Johnny or Team Amber, and why. This is the question that I want you to ask yourself tonight and to challenge the assumptions you may have made and how you may have reached them. In our book, we identify 3 different types of defamation cases, and I'll outline them in respect to what happened in the Depp and Heard cases. The first is where you see the alleged perpetrator sue the newspaper for printing her story. And in that instance, the woman has no agency over the proceedings. The newspaper could, and they do often, settle for commercial reasons. The implication being that they couldn't defend her truth, when in fact it's made for monetary reasons. She has no control over the proceedings or how or whether it will be defended. All she can do is provide evidence in support of the newspaper defending her allegations. And the case that Depp took against the Sun in the UK is an example of that. The second type of case is where the alleged perpetrator sues the woman for telling her story about his abuse. And in that instance, she faced the cost and stress risk of the legal proceedings, being cross-examined by his lawyers in court, and potential damages. And as Keina explained, many women can't afford to defend these cases. This is the case that Depp took against Amber personally in the US, seeking millions of dollars against her. And it is a really good example of it. The third type is where we see the alleged perpetrator sue family and friends of the woman for speaking out in support of her and the allegations she's made against him. The cost burden then falls on them. And again, all the woman can do who has made the allegations is to give evidence to support their defense. So unusually, Amber faced 2 of these cases. But how did they come about? Amber did what we expect victims in society, or we say that they should do. She took her allegations to the court. It was in 2016 that she went to a court in California to obtain a restraining order against Depp on the basis of her allegations of domestic violence. The judge in that case found that her allegations were sufficiently credible to grant that order. The matter was widely reported in the global media. She didn't want to speak publicly about the allegations, and all she did to receive the restraining order was explain one recent incident of domestic violence and said that there were many more examples, but chose not to talk about them all. After she got the restraining order, she and Depp got a divorce and they settled the matter. She signed an NDA and that was the end of it. She didn't speak publicly about the allegations again. Now, this all took place pre-Me Too. So this is back in 2016, so before the Me Too movement kicked off. And really the matter sort of faded away into footnotes and glossy profiles about the 2 of them. But after Me Too hit, commentators and newspaper journalists were starting to ask questions in the context of the commentary around Me Too. Why was it that Johnny Depp was still being cast in J.K. Rowling's franchise, for example, when he had a restraining order, a domestic violence restraining order taken out against him? Ultimately, that created sufficient noise that Depp then decided to sue the Sun newspaper in the United Kingdom for publishing an article which asked the question why J.K. Rowling, a supporter of Me Too and Time's Up, could cast a known quote-unquote wife beater in her films. The Sun chose to defend that case on the basis of the truth defense. So that required that meant that the Sun had to bear the burden to prove Amber's allegations were true. Amber called me for advice about what she should do, and I had to explain to her that she was in a difficult predicament. There was always the risk, if she chose not to give evidence, that the Sun might choose to settle for commercial reasons, and he would then go around saying, look, she lied. It was defamatory. It's not true that I hit her. Faced with that prospect, she took the difficult decision to give evidence in the proceedings in the United Kingdom. I worked with Amber for 2 years to prepare the evidence in that case and to support the Sun's legal team in defending the case. In the lead up to that trial, Amber faced a relentless PR campaign led by Depp's lawyer, who claimed that her allegations were a hoax, that she'd painted on her own bruises to falsely accuse him, that she was misrepresenting herself as a victim, which defrauded the real victims of the Me Too movement. Of course, her allegations were made long before the Me Too movement even kicked off. In the book, I write about my experience of that trial, the rape and death threats that Amber and I both received, as well as the misinformation I observed in social media during the course of the trial about what was happening in court. Now, many people forget this, but the British judge found that the Sun had proved, based on Amber's evidence, that Depp had been violent towards her on 12 of the pleaded incidents of domestic violence that were run by the Sun as part of their defence. And I encourage people to go and have a look at that judgment because it sets out the evidence in detail, including how Amber's oral evidence was corroborated by medical records, contemporaneous recordings of conversations with Depp, and text messages and photos of her injuries. In short, the judge believed her, just as I do, and I still do. And after that judgment, I thought, surely no one will doubt her now. We've got a long articulated judgment that was based on weeks of evidence before a distinguished British High Court judge. But how wrong I was. Depp then sued Amber for defamation in the United States for millions of dollars over an op-ed that she wrote, speaking in her capacity as the ACLU Women's Rights Ambassador, about why women who choose to speak out about their experiences of sexual and domestic violence deserve more support. She did not name him. She didn't speak about the detail of any of the alleged incidents. She merely talked about what it was like becoming a public figure associated with allegations of domestic violence. He still sued her for millions of dollars. And of course, that trial, so high profile as it was, he was successful in front of a jury. What was disappointing about that, and I say this, and we write about it in detail as an observer, because I did not act for her in the US proceedings, which she lost, but was to watch society's reaction. Well, one, watch how Depp's lawyers defended that case, running all the old stereotypes about gender-based violence, Why didn't she go to the police? No one else has made a public accusation against him, therefore it's not true. She was doing it for fame or for money. All these kinds of allegations that were made both in court and outside of it. But what was astonishing to me as an observer of that case was the social media, the public discussion in the media and on social media about the case. All of the harmful tropes that we have jury directions about in criminal cases involving sexual and domestic violence, that judges are trained about so that they don't buy into them when they reach their conclusions, that judges are required to give juries warnings about in criminal cases, playing out online with a jury who was not sequestered and was reading all of this stuff online. Everybody was reading it. I was having friends call me up saying they couldn't believe the conversations and the fact that their kids, young children, were absorbing these gender-based violence tropes online. She's a gold digger. She's lying. She made it up for fame and money. These tropes coming out of their kids' mouths. And so some of the takeaways that I think we wanted to point out in that case is that it's really interesting that a lot of people came to some conclusions about that case because of what they saw on social media and the role of social media in a reputation management context in a global information environment. It didn't seem to matter to anyone that she had proven this before a British court. The Sun newspaper had proved it before a British court. People were making judgments about this based on social media videos. So I think we really need to start to think about what this means as a society and how far we need to go in terms of educating those about this and the silencing impact of this case, because how many women will speak out about their experience of gender-based violence when they see what happened to Amber Heard? So we encourage you to read our book, and you can hear about it in much more detail there.
Jennifer, Keina, thank you so much. That was such a powerful account of that case and of your work, which is incredible. And thank you for sharing it with us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Our third speaker this evening will be taking us into the skies and around some of the world's greatest cities. Mark Vanhoenacker is a commercial airline pilot for British Airways and the author of the international bestseller Skyfaring, A Journey with a Pilot. Mark is a columnist for the Financial Times and a regular contributor to the New York Times. He trained as a historian and worked as a management consultant before starting his flight training in Britain in 2001. He now flies the Boeing 787 Dreamliner from London to cities around the world, and his new book, Imagine a City, chronicles Mark's personal and often complex search for the meaning of home. Mark, welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to have a chance to share a personal story of flying and words, which relates to some of the themes in Imagine a City. I'm not the first pilot by any means to find joy in writing. There's actually quite a few pilots who write, whether that's for publication or for their own fans and their own communities. And there are so many of us that I'm often struck by how different these two roles are. Flying, of course, is incredibly structured. It's based around procedures and checklists and manuals. It's very rule-bound, despite or perhaps because of the freedom we may associate with flying. Even the words we use as pilots in the flight deck are pretty much all written. All the work-related ones are written down in a manual, what you say and when, and how we understand them. And of course, while there's nothing simple about flying to the far side of the world, there is a sort of linearity or at least a simplicity to our journeys, at least in a narrative sense, in the sense that we begin in one city, we fly along a planned, structured route, and we land in another city. And then we sign the logbook, and that's the end of that task until we next come to work. Writing, of course, is very different. There's the structure up to you, which is another way of saying there isn't a structure. The rules are few, and you're suggested to break them down. There are many routes to your destination as a writer, and that's assuming you know your destination. Many articles I write, and certainly the books I've written, end up. And of course, maybe you don't even know when you've reached your destination. Maybe your destination as a writer is wherever you run out of time, or your editors run out of patience. But I do think that flying and writing have something in common for me, and that revolves mostly around notions of connection. Airplanes, of course, literally connect people across borders and oceans and mountain ranges. On every flight are business people and of course tourists going to see a new part of the world. But there are also, of course, people who are emigrating, who are going to family reunions, to weddings, to funerals. Those scenes I see in an arrivals hall every time I get off a flight, departure halls as well, but especially arrival halls, remind me of the importance of some of the journeys. And for example, it reminds me as well of my parents who grew up on different continents and whose lives, and my life as well, depended on a few well. And of course, writing, I don't need to, I hardly need to mention it to a 5x15 audience who've gathered online like this. But writing is all about connection. It's a way of moving across our personal identities, across borders, language, cultures, miles, years, perhaps above all the things that might otherwise tend to separate us. And so for me, I've always been struck by E.M. Forster's epigraph, "Only connect," and for me, that summarizes what what flying and writing have in common for me. So if we bring up the first slide here, we see an image which is from my childhood bedroom. This is in the late 80s, I guess, in Western Massachusetts, in a city called Pittsfield. And no one who knows me now would be surprised to see that it's filled with airplanes and also with Pittsfield, my hometown, has an important role in Imagine a City in the new book, even though that book is also about some of the largest cities that have ever existed. Pittsfield is about 3 hours north of New York and about 2 hours west of Boston. It has some remarkable history for a small place. It was where the first agricultural fair was held in the US, which has become a national pastime. Speaking of pastimes, it's where the first written references to baseball. And on thinking of institutions like baseball, it was also the location of the baseball game, and it's also where Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. So he was in a farmhouse surrounded by snowy fields and hills in this fairly small inland settlement, not yet a city, still a town of just a few thousand people, writing about his journeys to the far side of the world. So when I look at this picture, I see the themes that have come to mean the most to me as an adult, as a professional. But I also have a sort of emotional reaction to it, which isn't entirely positive. So growing up as a gay kid in a place as small as Pittsfield at that time wasn't entirely easy. And for me, airplanes symbolized escape, and so did books. I associated both of those with ways of being other than where I was. I even had, if I think about words in another sense, I had a speech impediment growing up. I had a lot of difficulty saying that hard American R, which meant I had trouble saying even my own name, Mark, which people wouldn't understand sometimes. And my father, who was once commenting on that American R, and pointed out that different languages have different R's. And I thought, as a kid, I didn't say this to him, but I said, oh, well, I'll just learn one of those languages, move to one of those countries, and I'll be able to speak freely and live freely. And what you can't see in this picture is my desk, which is off to the left out of the frame. And that childhood desk, which faced east and looked over the bird, I also associate with words and airplanes because it's where I wrote a lot of letters to my pen pals. I had lots of pen pals. I had one in the Philippines, one in Australia, one in Finland. And I would write on these aerograms, which I'm not even sure they exist anymore, but it was a sheet of paper, a very lightweight paper that you would fold up after you wrote on it and then seal without any enclosures. And it was effectively pre-stamped. And they were light because they would go on airplanes. They would go on via airmail all over the world. And I had one pen pal in particular who I was in close contact with, and her name was Lily. She was in Hong Kong. And when I would write on those envelopes, I would write her name and then her street and then Chung Chau and then the postal code. And I assumed Chung Chau was just a district of Hong Kong. And I would send them off. And we told each other all about our hometowns. And I told her about Pittsfield and this the winters and the hills and the bears, and she told me about the skyscrapers and the sort of heaving harbor and all the things that astonished me when I would hear about a place like that. And I suppose I last wrote to her probably when I was 17. That was just before email. So we lost touch then. And fast forwarding, I went to university. I started a PhD in history. I never finished it. And I eventually became a pilot, fulfilling that childhood dream. Learned to fly the 747 after flying short-haul routes within Europe for several years. There's a 747 there on the dresser. It's a Pan Am one. I had a few others that are out of frame. And then it came for the night that I would first fly a 747, and the destination of that flight was to Hong Kong. So if we look on the next slide, we see an airfield chart for Hong Kong, and these charts are designed to help pilots move to and from and around a major airfield. And it's filled with with frequencies, communication frequencies, and heights, which is obviously significant there with the mountains and skyscrapers. And it also has a lot of beacons on it. And these beacons allow a pilot, the aircraft, to tune in a beacon, and then from that we can determine our bearing from the beacon, distance in some cases as well. And on the night I first flew a 747, we flew an arrival pattern into Hong Kong, and I was looking at the charts beforehand, and I looked down and I saw this beacon, which is highlighted Chung Chau. Jack, if we can just bring up the next version there. Yes, that's a beacon, and you can see the little blue line along the right side pointing off to an island. And so I saw that on the map, and then overflew it and thought, wow, I guess that's where Lily lived. And then I landed the plane and went off to explore the city. And Hong Kong became a city I got to know very well. It's a city that's easy to love for visitors. The food is amazing, obviously, and there's lots of urban hikes, which you can do. And I probably went there, I don't know, 20 or 30 times. And when I would fly in, I would pass that beacon at Chung Chau, and I would think about Lily, but I never thought of a way to reach out to her. I didn't know where she would live now, if she was even still in Hong Kong. Fast forward again a little bit, and then the pandemic arrived, and I flew throughout the pandemic, but it was a very strange time to be flying, goes without saying, and it really challenged my notions of connection. We were mostly flying cargo, protective equipment, medical equipment, ordinary cargo, and we were staying no longer in city centers, but in airport hotels. In some of those hotels, we couldn't leave the hotel during our entire stay there. And in some of them, we couldn't even leave our room. We would have a key card that was programmed to only work once. This is around the time I was finishing Imagine City. So I spent a lot of time in these hotel rooms writing about the cities around me that I couldn't see, and writing about Pittsfield, this place that I had come from, and that seemed so far away when I was in these airport hotels, and yet was still in my imagination a very important place, and formed a large part of the book. Then this year, a few months ago, Hong Kong unlocked, and we went back, and having realized what it would be like to never see the city again, I thought, well, I should really go to Chung Chau. I should just go and see this place where my pen pal once lived. So if we look at the next slide, this is a gray day a few months back. I think it was in March or beginning of April in Hong Kong. And I thought, I'm going to take one of the commuter ferries out to Chung Chau. I love ferries. They're a great way to explore cities, a great way to take a break from walking, which is the other thing I mainly do in cities. And eventually this boat pulls into the harbor at Chung Chau. And my first feeling was, I was just astonished at what a small place it was. I had always thought she was, living in an apartment tower somewhere, and I thought, oh, this isn't a very big place at all. So I looked on a map, and suddenly, without even really trying to think of it, the name of her street popped into my head, and then the number did as well. So I thought, well, I've got a few hours here. I'll just walk down her street. And so if we jump to the next slide. I walked down her old street and I passed her house number, and then which is off to the left. And on the right is a very small urban park. It was a very hot day. I was probably a little sleepy. So I thought I'm just going to sit in this park for a little while and think about what it meant to have written letters that I would write those aerograms and fold them up and take them down to the mailbox through the snow, and then they would get on a plane, almost certainly a 747, and would end up arriving in Hong Kong and then being carried to a house that I could now look at. And I thought about what her letters coming back to me meant, that letters that began there would travel all the way to Pittsfield, a place that, I mean, it's hard to imagine a more different place, is the shorter version of it. So I was sitting there and just thinking about what those connections meant to me, and what it meant to have friends on the far side of the world, and to anticipate a life beyond circumstances I found trying. When all of a sudden I looked up and I saw two people coming down the street. One was an elderly man, and with him was a woman around my age. Before I could stop myself, I didn't even think about it. I just ran up and I said, and I walked up to her and I said, Lily, it's me, it's Mark, it's your pen pal. And she looked at me and she said, oh my God, of course it's you, of course. We'd exchanged so many photos back then. She said, I've followed your writing. I follow you on Facebook and Twitter, and I've read your articles and books, and they're just such a great joy. She said to me, I've just going to help my father upstairs. It's time for his nap, and I'm going to put my shopping away, and then I'll come back down. She said, I know the perfect place to have lunch.
Mark, thank you so much. What an ending. That was just such a lovely testament to that connection and to those memories. And thank you for sharing it with us this evening. Our fourth speaker tonight is Jeffrey Boakye, an author, broadcaster, educator, and journalist with a particular interest in issues surrounding race, masculinity, education, and popular culture. Jeffrey has taught secondary English for 15 years, and he's the author of several books, including Hold Tight, Black Masculinity, Millennials, and the Meaning of Grime, and What is Masculinity? Why Does It Matter? And Other Big Questions. His latest book, I Heard What You Said, A Black Teacher, A White System, is a thought-provoking and fearless exploration of dismantling racism in the classroom and doing better by our students. Jeffrey, thank you for being with us.
Hi there. I'll get straight into it, actually. One of the best things about being a teacher is that you don't always hear the insults that people throw at you because they happen in classrooms and corridors where you're not present. But there is one insult in my 15 years teaching English that I not only heard, but I saw it written on an exercise book. It said, Mr. Boakye is a waste man. Now, I don't know how much you know about Jamaican patois, but waste man is not a good thing to be called, right? I've got a definition, hold on. It says here, a stupid person or someone who is behaving in a stupid way. He turned out to be a complete waste man. You had your chance and you blew it, you waste man. That's taken from a website. The person that called me a waste man was one of my students, obviously. His name, I call him Malachi in the book. It's not his real name. And we butted heads. You know, I was frustrated. To cut to the chase, it was all me. It usually is in a teacher-student relationship. It was my frustrations. He was struggling to get on with the subject. He was quite heavily dyslexic, actually, undiagnosed. And that meant that English lessons were hard work for him. It was doubly frustrating for him because he's probably one of the best writers that I've ever met. And I'm not just saying that for dramatic purposes. He had a voice. He had a way of expressing himself. He could do different genres. He just couldn't put pen to paper. And so, as we all have, he had a winning strategy to get through Mr. Boakye's English lessons, and that was to be naughty. It's one of the most, successful winning strategies of all time, play up. So we butted heads. And then I went too far. I said something stupid like, it's much better when you're not here. And then he storms out, and then written on his exercise book, minutes later, is Mr. Boakye is a waste man. And it got me thinking. Every story needs an inciting incident. I spend a lot of time thinking about this because I'm fascinated by stories. And that in many ways is one of the inciting incidents for that part of my teaching career. Because I started to think, am I a waste man? Like, am I a stupid person behaving in a stupid way? And I was. I had to back off. I had to be humble. And essentially, I had to apologize. But there's different ways of apologizing. Teachers don't always say sorry. Adults are really bad at this, I've found. We find it difficult to relinquish the control required to just say, I am sorry, I've done something wrong. But my actions were an apology. I thought about Malachi deeply, and I thought about, well, how can I bring him into the center? How can I do something that speaks to him? Because the relationship was not working. I was reading at the time, the biggest book I've ever read. Look at it, it's ridiculous. It's called The 7 Basic Plots by Christopher Booker, ironically called Basic, look at the size of it. And it's all about the different shapes of stories. That's why I know about things like inciting incidents. I'm an English teacher, what do you expect? And I started thinking about how I could bring students into this by way of them bringing their own stories to the theory in this book. And that sparked something off in my head. A whole project whereby I invited the students to bring their stories of their choice, their narratives, their lived literary experiences into the classroom, and then they would build out of that a curriculum that was bespoke to their interests. It sounds relatively simple, but this is revolutionary because the curriculum is actually very, very narrow and very, very fixed. You know, it's very brittle, it doesn't flex. And I was designing something that had maximum flex. Malachi loved it. He wanted to do a video essay because that was something that he felt more comfortable doing to express his thoughts. He brought all sorts of texts in, not just books, but film and music and all those kind of things that I was interested in too. We had a lot in common, actually, Malachi and I. Not least of all, we're both Black. I'm Black African, my heritage. He was Black Caribbean. There's a whole conversation there. But we both know what it's like to grow up in the 21st century in the United Kingdom with a color of skin that has been racialized and marginalized. Now, what was interesting there is that that inciting incident was a bit of a revolution for me in my teaching journey. You know, that's what my book is all about. It's actually the story of me. The editor that I worked with, I've only ever gotten one good piece of advice from 2 separate editors. It's the same thing. It's tell your story. And in my story, I had to kind of realize that making these connections with my students, bringing lived experiences into the center of the teaching and learning conversation, that is what it's all about. That independent book project based on the 7 basic plots led to all of my students bringing all of their own texts in. Some kids wanted to do Harry Potter, fair enough. One kid wanted to do Scarface. I said, you can't do Scarface, it's not age appropriate. He said, I'm doing Scarface. I said, okay, you're doing Scarface. And he did a whole project about the story of Scarface. It was fascinating. Now, all of this is a preamble really to get into kind of what I wrestled with when I was planning my 5x15. This is planned, by the way, I've got notes and everything. And it was, what is the story that I want to tell? The book itself, I heard what you said, it starts off with the story of my face not being recognized by one of those school security systems where it takes a picture of your face and then it turns the picture into a security pass and then you're allowed into a school for safeguarding reasons. I tried that. I was at the school and it said face not recognized. And I moved left, I moved right, I moved into the light, out of the light, face not recognized. And it's basically because these facial recognition systems are mad racist and they don't recognize what we call Black skin as normal skin because of the default whiteness of a white supremacist society. It's happened to me 3 times, actually. I only mentioned it once in the book. So that's actually the beginning of a story about me not being recognized by education. I speak in metaphors. If you don't like metaphors, you're going to hate this. But if you do like metaphors, welcome to the family. So that metaphor is almost like the beginning of my own journey. But we can go a little bit deeper, because when I was crafting this, I thought, well, what is my story? What would the 7 basic plots have to say about the story of Jeffrey Boakye in I Heard What You Said? Is it a comedy? You know, from confusion to clarity. Is that the story that we're telling here? Mix-ups of identity. ending in order, starting in order, but getting completely convoluted along the way. Comedies include things like Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. That's a good comedy. I've taught that a few times. Or, you know, Toy Story. I'm a millennial, so I own DVDs still. Toy Story, that's a comedy where they don't know who each other are, and by the end of it, they fall in love, basically. That's what a comedy is. Is it a tragedy? Am I a tragic hero? You know, with my pride and my hubris leading me to a dark fate, victim of my own fatal flaws, you know, like Macbeth or Othello, to keep it Shakespeare. Like any tragic hero, the best of you is the worst of you. I'm a people pleaser. My aim to please is something which gets me quite far, especially in the realm of teaching, connecting with people. But at the same time, it can be a bit of a stumbling block. Maybe there's a slight arrogance as well to thinking you know things and then presenting these ideas, believing my own insights. You know, it's only when I realized that teaching was my workshop, you know, and that I was gonna make mistakes. That's when I actually started to develop and grow as a teacher, when I started to really think about that harder. Is it a rags to riches story? I don't know. I started in debt and I still got a mortgage, so I don't know if that works. Charlie and Chocolate Factory, that kind of thing. In many ways, I'm gathering insights. You know, the story that I started with about me and young Malachi, that's a story of learning. That's a story of being marginalized and gathering insights as a result of that. Malachi was marginalized in lots of different ways. Not only was he a teenager, so you know, he was marginalized by youth. He was also a Black teenager, marginalized by ethnicity and background and race. He was also, as I said, dyslexic. So there were learning difficulties that he had that really marginalize you in the education system that doesn't speak to that. But is it a rags to riches story for me? You know, have I come out the other end with a chocolate factory and with, you know, Cinderella's ball behind me? Maybe not. Maybe it's a voyage and return story. Another DVD from my collection. I told you I'm a true millennial. I'm keeping hold of stuff. Back to the Future, the voyage and the return, when you go into a place and you return with a new perspective on it. That could be something, because I left a very, very, well, let me call it what it is. I left a very Black world as a child. And as I entered increasingly professional spaces, it became increasingly white. And my return to my Black identity is something that kept me grounded in a wider mission. I realized partway through my teaching, when I wrote a book called Hold Tight about grime music, about being a Black male, about millennials in general, people read it, because when you write a book, sometimes people read it, it's mad. And they realized I was Black. So a lot of my colleagues were like, oh, wow, you're actually Black. So I came out as Black in 2016. And that was a return to an identity that I didn't ever speak about professionally, because when I was learning to teach in 2007, race was not brought up at all. In fact, it was a taboo. And that's one of the themes, that when you don't feel something is safe to talk about, you don't talk about it, because that's your survival, you know? So maybe it was a voyage and return, a return to my own Blackness. It's getting deep now. Maybe it's a quest. This is a quest. Finding Nemo, looking for something, you know, be it a fish or looking for something else, looking for the holy grail of teaching, looking for a solution to a problem, looking for a way to span generational gaps, a way to represent students, plural, and all the myriads of lived experiences that you meet when you teach, because that's the best thing about teaching. You meet so many people, you know, it's second only to air traffic controllers. That'll take you back to our last talk. Air traffic controllers have to deal with lots of human interaction in very high stakes scenarios, stressful. Teachers have to do the same thing in schools, equally stressful, but we don't get breaks every 20 minutes. Or is it a rebirth story like Groundhog Day, one of the best films of all time, a fable where you were reborn? Am I being reborn? The last type of story that it could be, and I think I'm going to rest on this one, is Overcoming the Monster. I've not got a DVD for this, but it's like Jaws, you know, or any Bond film where there's a monstrous force that is trying to destroy the world and you have to fight it. I think maybe that is what is going on here in the subtext of these anecdotes that I'm spinning for you. But who or what is the antagonist? Is it the education system in general? Is it the Tories, you know, to get political? Is it the political system? Is it Michael Gove specifically? He was the education secretary when I was training to be a teacher and when I became a teacher, and his vision for education is one that I was fighting against. I could feel myself. I don't think so. I think that in the riverbed of a lot of what I've said today, the real monster that I'm overcoming is white supremacy. It's such a monster that you never even say it. It's like Voldemort in Harry Potter. You don't say the name because something bad's going to happen. I spend my time now visiting schools and businesses and talking about anti-racism and what is generously dubbed subconscious bias in EDI work, the euphemisms we use to talk about anti-racism. And what is very rarely said are the words white supremacy. It's the big unnamed monster. It's the bed of social inequity in this country, in the West in general. You know, it's the reason for colonial exploitation, the genocide of colonial capitalist exploitation, empire, and the absolute cruelty that comes with empire, of which I am part. I speak this language so fluently, so arrogantly, one language I speak because I'm of the British Empire. My parents were born in a country called the Gold Coast, named for its most valuable resource. Malachi's forebears came over here on the empire windrush, seeking a new life perhaps, seeking employment opportunities, and meeting something less than a warm welcome if you look at generationally. So white supremacy is the thing that I'm trying to fight. It's the thing that I wrestled with in my own work. Because, you know, Malachi exists in a system where he was 9 times more likely to be arrested than his peers who are racialized as white. His Asian peers were 4 times more likely to be arrested, disproportionately likely to be excluded from school. And the exclusion to prison pipeline is a real thing. Racially profiled, still happening as we speak. Suella Braverman has issued a report saying something about knife crime and young Black males, as though the most knife crime doesn't happen in many parts of the country that are not dominated by young Black males. The CV lottery, where your African surname is statistically less likely to be hired, despite the fact that Black Africans go to university at higher rates than other ethnic groups, you know, and the fact that, you know, non-white university students are far less likely to end up at the Russell Group universities, despite doing well-ish at their A-levels and their GCSEs. The basic facts of imperialism and white supremacy not being taught. So maybe I am a waste man, because there's another definition. I'll read it to you. It says, a worker who removes waste, such as one who collects and disposes of waste that accumulates during a manufacturing process. Because our society is manufactured. Don't get it twisted. I've lived in education. That's one of the engine rooms of the modern West. That's where society is not only learned, but also grown. Our education system teaches society. That's why it's so shackled to the past. And that's why it's so scared of change, because it's reiterating truths that have been iterated already. And in that process, that manufacturing process, there is a lot of waste, there's a lot of detritus. And a big part of that is this thing, this white supremacist mindset, this paradigm linked to patriarchy, linked to all sorts of isms and phobias that are stopping us from actually going forward, that are stopping us from progressing. When I write, when I visit schools, when I work, I'm trying to keep education free of the waste. I'm trying to clear out the garbage. And that process has been illuminating for me. It's been edifying for me. And if you really read between the lines, it's been where the success lay, you know, when it's tackled head on, and when I can reach out and meet people who are also suffering from the same thing that's been kind of holding that education system back for, well, a number of centuries now. So that's my story. You can choose out of those 7, the one which is most applicable. But for now, let's say that I'm a waste man who's on a mission. All right, we're done.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. That was so illuminating and edifying for us, and there are so many lessons to learn there. Thank you. Our final speaker this evening is Janina Ramirez, an Oxford lecturer, BBC broadcaster, researcher, and author. She's presented and written over 30 hours of BBC history documentaries and series on TV and radio, and she's the author of numerous books for children and adults. Her new book, Femina, is a groundbreaking reappraisal of medieval history, revealing why women were struck from our historical narrative and restoring them to their rightful positions as power players who shaped the world that we live in today. Janina, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello and welcome to all of you. I hope you can hear me okay. It is such a pleasure to talk to you this evening. I want to start with a question. Can finding women in the past help us shape a better, fairer future? It's a big claim for a historian, but I think the answer is yes. And I want to take you with me as we challenge some historical mistruths, as we reveal new evidence, new ways of looking to the past, and try to understand the stories that we've been told about history. And thinking first off about women's rights, surely we're on this trajectory, always moving forward through history, that we are in a constant state of progress, building on the achievements of those that have gone before, growing towards a fairer, more equal future. Well, yes, in some ways, but in others, no. And we begin our story in many cases thinking about the rights of women just in the last 100 years. We could say, couldn't we, that the rights that I as a woman have today is a direct result of the efforts made by the suffragettes 100 years ago. That's when these rights began, sure, yeah? Well, that's not the full story. For me to be able to take you back in time, let's go back firstly, just 100 years. Now, I am a medievalist. I'm going to be taking you many hundreds of years, indeed many thousands of years back in just 15 minutes. But let's start in the summer of 1913. At the Epsom Derby. Now, this was the major sporting event in the Edwardian calendar. Thousands and thousands of people pouring through the gates to witness horses racing just for a few moments, reaching speeds of up to 70 kilometers an hour. And in this environment, you would have everybody rubbing shoulders together, royalty alongside shoe shiners. It was chaotic, noisy, and a bustling, incredible time. Now, in 1913, something very different was happening because these events were being filmed on cameras. And those images were going to be sent across the world, shown in cinemas across the Commonwealth. And so the action of this event was going to be memorialized. And if you think about the start of the race, it's coming up to 3 o'clock. The horses are pacing. They're frothing at the mouths. They're ready to go. Starter pistol takes off. The horses belt out around the course. There is a horse running called Anma, who is the king's horse. And the rider is wearing the king's colours of red and blue. But he's not the favourite. The favourite is Crackamore, who is going forward in violet, and there's a break between the groups of horses, the first with a chance at victory, while a second group lags slightly behind. Now, the way that most people watched the Derby live was in these stalls, these arenas, pressed up against the white barrier that ran right alongside the course. And what would happen is once the horses had run past, people would dive underneath the barrier and follow the horses to the finish line. That was part of the tradition at that point. And at one of the really decisive moments in the race is Tattenham Corner, one of the big bends on the final stretch. There are 3 film cameras all trained on Tattenham Corner, and the horses come around. The first group move ahead. They're going to have a chance at victory. Then there's a little gap, and something extraordinary happens. A figure is shown going very calmly underneath the barrier, walking into the path of these speeding horses and reaching up towards the king's horse. Now, the horse sees this figure, tries to leap, jump to avoid them. The rider is thrown off the horse. The figure is smashed to the ground. The horse gets up, completes the race. The rider is unconscious, and so is this figure alongside them. Now, the rider will recover. The other figure will not. They go on to die a few days later, never having regained consciousness. But while this figure is lying in their hospital bed, hate mail is piling up on their bedside table, because it transpires that this figure, dramatically knocked over and killed at the Derby, was a woman named Emily Wilding Davidson. She was a suffragette, and she became the martyr to the suffragettes' cause. She was a militant suffragette. She had been involved in quite dangerous activities, including setting fire to post boxes, and she had been force-fed over 40 times and imprisoned. She had nearly died when she'd thrown herself off a landing in a prison in order to save a fellow suffragette that was imprisoned with her. She had not meant to go to the Derby, it seemed. Nobody seemed to know why she was there. She was actually supposed to be down the road at the Suffragettes' Fair in Kensington, but she purchased a return ticket. She had put 2 suffragettes' flags inside her coat, and she had made her way to the Derby to disrupt it. Did she mean to die? Well, as a result of her death, the move for women to get the vote was galvanized. It had stalled both the suffragists through peaceful legal measures and the suffragettes through more militant measures had reached a bit of a dead end in terms of pushing for the vote. But at Emily's funeral, tens of thousands of people lined the streets. It's the single highest attended non-royal funeral in English history at this point. The suffragettes are shown there in white, following through the streets of London. And just a matter of years later, they did indeed get the vote. And the reason I was fascinated by Emily and her story, because she becomes this figurehead and people know so much about what happened to her at the Derby. But one thing that I found, which was a footnote on a footnote on a footnote in one of the many books and articles written about her, was that Emily, like me, was a medievalist. Now, I knew that the suffragettes had great affection for the medieval period. They were part of a whole medieval revivalist movement in the late Victorian and Edwardian period. That's why the Houses of Parliament looks like a Gothic masterpiece. And that's why the pre-Raphaelites were painting these sort of very fey-looking women in towers. But, and indeed, they make Joan of Arc one of their figureheads. This image you can see on the screen at the moment is a huge sculpture that was at the entrance to the Suffragettes' Fair, where Emily was supposed to be. And the suffragettes have the slogan, "Deeds, not words," but they started to tie that to Joan of Arc's slogan, which is "Fight on, and God shall give the victory." We see her again on this example of the Suffragette magazine shown on the front. She was this perfect example of androgynous militant activity and the perfect rallying cry for the suffragettes, who weren't just politically engaged, but also very pious Christian individuals. So she was a saint and she was a warrior who was fighting against this idea of women as the second sex. Went on to, in fact, lead the French army to victory, a 16-year-old peasant girl from Orléans, in an extraordinary historical twist. But why did I find it so significant that Emily Wilding Davidson was a medievalist? Well, I dug deeper. I started to look further into her writings. She wrote many, many articles and poems and stories, all set in the medieval period. She had actually gone to Oxford to sit her finals in medieval literature, but because in the turn of the 20th century, women couldn't graduate, they could sit their finals, but they couldn't get a degree. She obviously didn't get to that final life achievement, but she continued to write, particularly about Chaucer, and her favorite tale, it seems, even from childhood, was The Knight's Tale. She even calls herself Fair Emily after the main protagonist. Now, something very significant happens in The Knight's Tale that doesn't come into the story of why Emily died at the Epsom race. in that story, there is a description of how the Amazons, the female warrior women, wanted to appeal to Theseus, to the ruler, when he returned from battle. They wanted to appeal to the king, appeal to the ruler. And so they lay in the streets, and one of them offered up a gift to the king. Is that what Emily was actually doing? Did she want to die, or was she in fact petitioning the king? If she had been, then she was following a long medieval tradition of the king being accountable to his subjects and people being able to appeal to him. She chose the racecourse, she chose the horse with deadly consequences, but ultimately her aim was successful. What I found really interesting when I started to read Emily's stuff was, as a medievalist, I realized that she and so many of the other suffragettes did not believe that they were forging forward into a vacuum. They did not believe that their militant activities and their desire to have rights for women was something that had never gone before. What they instead seemed to be believing was that there was a time hundreds of years ago where women had greater agency, greater power, greater autonomy than they had in the 20th century. Now, this flies in the face of what I said at the beginning, isn't it, about this idea of continual progress, continual movement towards a better future. I dug some more, and it was really shocking what I uncovered. I have been studying the medieval period my whole life, and yet I only realized in the course of writing my book, Femina, that so many of the injustices we battle with today, including racism, classism, ableism, and of course, misogyny and sexism, these divisions in society that we still lean into and are still fighting against, their genesis is relatively recent. It's with the Reformation from the 15th century onwards, 16th century onwards, that we start to get this idea of a woman's place is in the home. It is as empire and colonies expand into after the Industrial Revolution that we get a sense of a rigid class system, if we get a sense of the proper right way that an Englishman conducts himself abroad, and women's relation to that, and people of other backgrounds' relationship to that. And these are more recent phenomenon. You might assume that if you look to the medieval period, you will see a time where there is great division, where there is no opportunity for women, where the church, its all-encompassing misogyny and power, actually suppresses and oppresses women. In fact, I found so many exceptions to that rule. It's John Calvin in the 16th century that says a woman's place is in the home. We move on from that to where we are today. And looking backwards, even back to the 7th, 8th, 9th century AD, you can find women as equal, if not greater, landowners, traders, artists, scientists, polymaths, creatives, writers. And they had a space available to her, funnily enough, through that most patriarchal of institutions, the church, the Catholic Church, because convents, double monasteries, anchorites, even lay women who were mystics, they had spaces that took them out of the domestic sphere. While the majority of women in the medieval period would be wives, mothers, aunts, while they would be forced into arranged marriages and then suffer death very often through childbirth, live under the fear of physical abuse and rape, there was one other option available, which was to enter into one of these spaces, a convent, a double monastery, a collection of women living together in safety, in sanctuary. And today we might think of the words nun and the words convent and think of something frightfully pious and separate from the world, quiet places with, where people are just taking themselves away from the pleasures of life in order to sort of indulge their spiritual enterprises. But in fact, these spaces in the medieval period were everything. They were the universities, the hospitals, they were the publishing houses, the art centres, the music centres, the creative hubs of the medieval world. And in these spaces, women were creating pieces in all disciplines that were equal to, if not rivaling, their male counterparts. I could tell you about Hildegard of Bingen, the polymath from the 12th century Rhineland, who I think exceeds Leonardo da Vinci in her intellect and achievements. I could tell you about Marjorie Kemp, the fabulous medieval mystic from King's Lynn, who tried her hand at all sorts of different businesses and ultimately reinvented herself in the way that an influencer would today. But I'm going to settle on another example. But just before I tell you about them, I want to think about why looking at the past differently matters. When I studied history at school, to be honest, I hated it. I did dates, data, and details about great men who had gone before. I couldn't see myself in the past at all. And as a result, I went on to think, well, I'm going to read literature. Books tell me about how people from the past thought. I can find myself more in books and in art and in archaeology and in artifacts. History felt like I was excluded from it. But the discipline of history is changing. We're thinking more about social history, about the people on the edges of society, about how an individual in their exceptional nature only is there by virtue of the societies, the communities, the ideologies around them. And that is how I'm trying to rediscover the lost women of the medieval period. And I am fighting with many mistruths, many things that have been taught to us across time and assumed to be facts. Let me take you very briefly to the world of the Vikings. Now, if you go to any fancy dress shop, the first thing you'll be handed if you say you want a Viking outfit is a horned helmet. But in fact, the Vikings never wore horned helmets. No horned helmets have ever been discovered in a Viking context. The headpieces they would have worn were more like skull caps designed to sort of protect the head during battle. And in fact, wearing a horn helmet would have been entirely impractical. It would have made you unbalanced. It would have made you stand out on a battlefield. And if you got one whack in the wrong place, you'd have a horn going straight through your skull. So no, they didn't wear horned helmets. Where has this come from? It's come from the 19th, 20th century. And it occurred when Wagner's Ring Cycle was being staged. Apparently, the costume designer, just before the opera was due to be released, went to the back of the auditorium and realized they could not tell the difference between the good characters and the bad characters. So they went back down, changed the costumes. They put wings on the good characters' helmets and horns on the bad characters' helmets. And from that time, we have been told Vikings wore horned helmets. It is not true. And it is one of so many mistruths about the Vikings. But how can finding women change our view? Very briefly, this is the Boakye warrior grave. It was discovered at the turn of the 20th century, and it was declared the finest warrior grave ever discovered. In it was an individual on a throne, surrounded by a full armory of weapons, with a mare and a stallion sacrificed at their feet. And because there were weapons in there, the archaeologists said, it's a man. And because it's the greatest warrior grave, it was a man. Fast forward to 2017, technology, DNA analysis, advances in science meant that we could return to this burial. And what they did was run the DNA, and they discovered 2 X chromosomes. The Boakye warrior was the Boakye warrior woman. Why does this matter? It matters because we now have new tools to discover what has always been hidden in plain sight, that women always did have rights, but they have been written out of records, that women always did have agency, but that has been stripped away. By finding the women from the medieval past, I have been inspired to see potential for myself that I didn't believe was there in the past. You cannot be what you cannot see. And I am going to present to you in that book so many people that will inspire us to think differently and think about a more equal, balanced future that in many ways is more like the past. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me.
Janina, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and what an amazing note to end on, really upending our ideas of that history. Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our brilliant speakers tonight, to Lewis, Jennifer, Keina, Mark, Jeffrey, and Janina. It's been such a pleasure to learn from all of you. Please do check out 5by15's website for information about our future events. We have 2 events next week. On Tuesday, we're with the writer Lucy Jones, who will be in conversation about her new book, Matrescence, with Amy Liptrot. And on Thursday, in the second of our events with Keystone Positive Change, we have Tim Smedley and Alok Jha speaking about solving the world's water crisis. They are both not to be missed. Thank you again and good night.